Morning everybody, and welcome to this, the fourth session of the 2018 school. This morning we have a panel of speakers to discuss the role of the CEA as a campaigning organisation in the support of the Irish cause in Britain. I'm not going to say anything beyond just to introduce your chair for this morning, Tony Donaghy, who is currently president of the Connolly Association and former president of Britain's Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, and has spent an active life in the trade union and labour movement in Britain. Just to remind you before I get off the stage, food is in the long stone. And there's also the Trinity Hotel next door, if anybody who wants to go there. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to ask Tony to start the proceedings this morning.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this morning's session. Thank you all for coming on a Sunday morning. I would first of all, on behalf of the Connolly Association, I would very much indebted really to the Greaves School and the committee for setting up, the schools that we're having each year, because what we do here at the school every year, as we are putting in for history to see, for further generations, the political situation in Ireland, the economic situation in Ireland, and of course as well the cultural aspect of life. So, as I say, the Connolly Association is indebted to all the hard work that's put in to keep it going. Now, I'm not going to say too much about the association because the two speakers up here are going to dwell in detail about it. I've been in the association now since probably the late 60s, and really the Connolly Association introduced me as an individual to, first of all, as an Irish worker in England. First of all, to join the appropriate trade union in the railways, which I worked in and retired from recently. But also, as well, it wasn't that long before somebody came up to me, first of all, with an Irish Democrat. It was Joe O'Connor, who was a worker on the maintenance side on London Transport. And Joe says, he said, that's the Irish Democrat. He says, and what you need to do, he says, now, he says, is to join the Connolly Association. And I did join the Connolly Association. And of course, that was a very sort of activity-moded time. The 60s and the 70s, as you well know. And we had, for example, always the most fond memory, really, is selling the Irish Democrat, the monthly paper, in the pubs in London. Now, I couldn't tell you all the stories that and the comments that you get when you're selling newspapers in pubs, or we used to sell newspapers in pubs. And the bit that I used to quite often do Camden, because of shift work and it was near my home and that, and I would be Greaves and myself, and also other people, but mainly Greaves, and we used to go into the pubs, and sometimes there'd be wild, loud music. Sometimes good music, Irish music, but sometimes there'd be pop music. And I remember this one particular time, we came out of the pub, and I said to Desmond Greaves, I said, Desmond, do you think that there's anything revolutionary about pop music? Well, you should have heard what he said. And I'll never forget it. It's so repeatable, but there you are. The other thing that always sticks in my mind, sticking with the Irish Democrat and selling them in the pubs, there was probably the most repeated comment would be, when you go up to the Irish Democrat, they'd say, Sheriff, I wouldn't wipe my arse with that paper, you know? And of course our standard reply was, indeed you wouldn't, because there's some sharp leaks in it. You know, and if you were lucky then, they would look at you and say, well, this bloke or this woman's serious, you know? So that's that. Now the other thing I would like to do as president of the association is to really thank, you know, all the activists in the Connolly Association over the years, you know, those past, and also, I mean, you know, like people that are behind the scenes, you know, too many to mention really, but people like Jane Tate, for example, you know, who kept the books and kept the money side of things going, and Joe Dagan and people like that, you know what I mean? And there's too many to mention. But you know, and recently, of course, we lost Charlie Cunningham, who was an activist all his life, really, in the Connolly Association as well. So anyway, I'll not say any more about the Connolly Association, because we are recognised now quite widely, not only because we've been around 80 years, but I mean, Mick will touch on it. I mean, we've got our affiliations now from the labour and trade union movement are on the increase all the time. So we're still here, as they say, and we're still punching, as they say, as well. So that's enough from me. Now, I was talking about people in the past in the Connolly Association, and our first contributor is Tony Coughlin. And Tony Coughlin, like myself, arrived in London, and I don't know. Tony was probably more sort of motivated or active than I was, because he didn't wait for somebody to come and give him an Irish Democrat. He went to the meeting, the first Connolly Association meeting, probably the week he arrived, and he continued to do that and done Trojan work for the association in those years. And then he came back to Ireland again. And he's been, of course, here since then. He's been active, as you all well know, not only as a lecturer, but also particularly in relation to the European Union. And of course, the Connolly Association was one of the initiators of the opposition to the EEC when it first came about in the 60s, you see. So anyway, Tony will give you a history of the civil rights campaigns and what the Connolly Association did. So Tony Coughlin.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chairman. This year ending in 8 seems to be characterised by quite a number of anniversaries. 2018, we were talking over the weekend of the 100th anniversary of the end of the World War, and of course it's also around now the 50th anniversary of the civil rights movement in the north of Ireland, the 1960s civil rights movement, particularly 5th of October coming up. I'm sure will be marked by quite a lot of commemorative activity. And it's in that connection that I want mainly to speak today, because of course the Connolly Association had quite a bit of influence on the British side of things in relation to the civil rights movement. It's also the 30th anniversary a few days ago of the late Desmond Greaves' death, which led to the launch of this school by some of his friends to commemorate his work. And it's also got a personal memory, because 60 years ago this month I went to England and shook the dust of Cork City off my feet at the age of 22. You can walk out my age from that. And on my first night in London, a friend of mine, Cal O'Hurley, who was already in the association, fellow Corkman, brought me along to Connolly Association meeting, my very first night. I got involved very quickly from then on, and in the period from 1958 to 1961, when I returned here, I was very active in the association, and was, in fact, was full-time organiser in the last year of that period, 1960-61. As I say, I've given out these notes, and what I'm going to say is largely related to points in these notes. I'm not going to read them, of course, but there's been no decent study, in my opinion, of the civil rights movement as a whole. It's a complex movement that preceded, of course, the long war of the original IRA, broadly 67, 68, 69, 70, that period. There's no study of it that would do justice to all its various elements. And I think that's still a challenge to historians. And if there is such a book comes into being, or such a study, you will have to pay attention to the British side of things, because there was a huge change in the attitude of significant sections of the British Labour movement to the Irish question, to the Northern Ireland problem, to the civil rights situation in the north of Ireland between 1949 and 1969. 1949, immediately after World War II, the Unions were very close to the British establishment. They had participated wholeheartedly in the war, and the Ireland Act 1949 reflected that. The Ireland Act in 1949 said that there should be no change in the constitutional position of the north of Ireland without the consent of the Northern Ireland Parliament, without Stormont's agreement, which of course was nonsense legally, and was overthrown when Stormont was prorogued or abolished in 1972. But in 1969, 20 years after that, there was a significant block of Labour opinion who were really very critical of the Brooker administration in the north of Ireland. 20 years between those two dates, a big change, and was largely due, in my opinion, to the Connolly Association's work and that of the various others that it influenced. So that's important, because when the civil rights movement blew up in the north of Ireland in 68-9, of course, Captain O'Neill, who was the local Unionist Prime Minister, was under pressure from the civil rights movement. He was also under pressure from Harold Wilson's Labour government in London, and Wilson in turn was under pressure from a very large block of largely left-wing but not entirely MPs who were very critical of the Unionists. And so how that block came into being, how that group of critical Labour people, and there was a widespread concern too in trade union circles, or some trade union circles, that hasn't yet been told, that story. And it's largely the story of the Connolly Association and those it influenced. In relation to an organisation that's been 80 years in being, it's gone through many phases, it's done many things, and it's impossible here today, even between the two of us, to list more than a few of those. But it certainly had a big influence on the civil rights movement, and the whole idea of a civil rights movement as the way to break Unionist majority rule in the north of Ireland. Because I think it's fair to say that it was the Connolly Association and Desmond Greaves, who was the kind of political brain at that time in it, that thought up the idea of a civil rights movement as the way to undermine Unionist majoritarianism in the north of Ireland and all the abuses that went along with that. The association was founded in 1938, 80 years ago. It didn't have it had a different constitution then than it has now, as I say on point 4 of those notes. It sought to work for the complete freedom of the Irish people and to propagate the teachings of James Connolly. But that left open how do you get the complete freedom of the Irish people in England, and which of James Connolly's teachings are to be propagated. He was socialist, he was a nationalist, etc. And these were issues which were teased out to some extent during the first 18 years of the Connolly Association's existence. And it was only really in 1955, under the influence of Desmond Greaves, that the modern constitution of the association, the new constitution, was adopted in 1955 at its annual conference in Birmingham. And I mentioned that in page, the character of the new constitution, point 6 of those notes on page 2. Greaves joined the association way back in 41, but he was born in England, and as far as I know, he never set foot on the continent of Europe in the course of his life, but he knew these islands intimately. He became chairman of what was the London Connolly Club, because they used to be called Connolly Clubs in those days. They changed the name to Connolly Association 43. But after the war, of course, during the war, you had no Irish papers going to Britain, but the Connolly Association therefore had quite a large, the Irish Democrat, the monthly paper of the association, had a very large circulation during the war years. But it fell drastically after the war, and there was talk of closing the Irish Democrat, as it had then become called. It was originally Irish Freedom, and it became Irish Democrat in 1945. But Greaves took over the editorship in January 1948, as I say at the top of page 2 there. He went full-time in 51, and he remained editor from then until his death in 1988, a 40 years period of editing the Irish Democrat, which is online now. It's out of print. It ceased publication in the early 2000s. It kept going for about a decade after Desmond Greaves' death, but it ceased publication in the early 2000s. It's all online, and this story I'm just making a few points about is set out in detail online and should not be ignored by historians. Greaves, of course, was a major Labour historian. He wrote several books on Connolly, on Mellows, and nobody else has mentioned so far this weekend that the new edition of his classic Life and Times of James Connolly was produced a few months ago by the Connolly Association, Connolly Books here, and the Manifesto Press in Britain. Three joint publishers came together to produce a new edition, which I was given the honour and asked to write a new preface to. So this is now available outside. I think it's retailed for a tenner, and it's a new version of this classic history. There are one or two some mistakes which Greaves himself had discovered and indicated in his own his own copy of the book, and these have been inserted. Some mistakes of this, minor things, nothing that changed the book fundamentally. So the new edition is well worth buying if you haven't already got it. Desmond Green, of course, as is well known, and some of his colleagues were members of the Communist Party of Britain. But I would say that the mass of the majority of the members of the association were not in any party. I was not in any party myself at that time, and now indeed since. But when in 1960-61 the Connolly Association members raised enough money to finance the wage of a national organiser for 1 year, I applied for the job and was given it. And I think one of the reasons perhaps was that I hadn't any particular party commitment. That was way back in 1960 and 61. But it was under Desmond Green's influence that the new constitution was adopted in 1955. And as I say in page 6.6 there, it was a democratic Republican constitution, not a socialist one. It's, as I said, the key point that's relevant here is the prime political aim of the association was to organise Irish men and women resident in Britain for the militant defence of their interests, as trade unionists, etc., and in united struggle with the British working class movement oriented over the labour movement, in particular to win support for the struggle of the Irish people for a united independent republic and to fight for the removal of all obstacles placed in their way by British imperialism. So it was a Republican organisation in that sense, seeking to organise Irish people in Britain in support of that particular issue and to try and win the labour movement in support of it, and as a means to that, in effect, to expose the injustice in the north of Ireland. As I say there in point 6, this was a Republican rather than a socialist programme. It inaugurated a 15-year campaign of anti-unionist education and propaganda in Britain, directed at British labour and trade union circles. And that is quite important. You all know, I'm sure, the abuses that existed under the Stormont unionist regime before 1969-70. They're set out or summarised there in point 7. I looked up at Wikipedia on the Orange Order, and I swiped from it the second paragraph of that note, drawing attention to the way in which the Orange Order dominated northern governments and so on and so forth, all during that period. And of course the Catholic population who'd been stuck there at the time of partition under the Government of Ireland Act 1920, they resented that, and the resentments built up over decades and exploded eventually, of course, in the civil rights movement and what followed. A very important point to bear in mind, and I mentioned in point 8 here, is that there existed a parliamentary convention at the time that matters that were devolved to Stormont could not be raised at Westminster. So London MPs or Manchester MPs could not raise any issue relating to housing or discrimination or the allocation of jobs or gerrymandering of the Special Powers Act in the north of Ireland, because these are all devolved to Stormont. Whereas MPs and unionists, MPs as they mostly were, that came from the north to London, could talk about anything that happened in London, Birmingham and Manchester. This was a happy parliamentary convention. It was no more than a happy practice, which was sustained for a long time, because the last thing that British governments wanted was these issues to be raised in London. Well, that paper wall, or wall of silence, depending how he looked at it, greatly inhibited the things for years and years, and was the big problems in trying to get what was happening in the North of Ireland raised at Westminster. And Labour MPs and others, tried to raise these issues, and the Speaker would say, "Oh, you can't raise this," and so on and so forth. That went on for years, and an important point to bear in mind. But it wasn't sustained indefinitely, of course. But the Connolly Association's campaign, based on their 55 constitution. So I got to London in September, October 58. I was right in the middle with the very first meeting I was at, in the Laurie Arms, I think they called it, a pub off the Edgware Road. They were talking about the Mann and Talbot trial. And in the last sheet of those notes I've handed out, I photocopied the pamphlet which the cover of the pamphlet of the association, which the association published. They asked this young lawyer, who's still alive, I believe, John Hostetler, to go to the North of Ireland to cover this trial and to document the abuses that accompanied it and spell out the background, the Special Powers Act and all the rest. And Hostetler did that, and this pamphlet was published by the association, Torture Trial in Belfast, dated 1958. And I was at meetings myself with him, because Hostetler went around various weeks to seek. The association would seek to get invitations to trade union branches to speak on this issue. And that was a time when lots of trade union branches did have meetings on political subjects. It doesn't happen very often now, I believe. But so Hostetler went around, and other conversation activists, where the trade unions or sometimes Labour Party branches agreed to hear this tale. So that was the beginning of that campaign. I was then involved in 59-60. In the campaign to get the release of the internees in Belfast, because there were nearly 200 or so internees in Crumlin Road, Belfast, as a result of the IRA's 56-62 border campaign. They were interned under the Special Powers Act without charge or trial, some of them for years on end. And Greaves thought that some of these must be members of British trade unions, and he did discover that some of them were Carpenters Union, Plumbers Union, and so on. And let's try and highlight the fact in Britain that some of your members, do you know that some of your members are in prison in Belfast for years on end without a charge, without a trial, under the Special Powers Act? And of course, they didn't know. And so this campaign of drawing attention to that in British labour and trade union circles was very much a big issue in 60 and 61. And then I was myself involved in going to people asking would they sign telegrams to Brookborough, drawing attention to the Special Powers Act and calling for the release of these people who were interned without charge or trial in the United Kingdom. And there were 3 successive telegrams. In 1961, before I came back to Ireland, over half the Parliamentary Labour Party had signed these. Parliamentary Labour, a big party in Britain, showing clearly that they were at least being educated on an aspect of the Special Powers Act. And there were other things that then happened, and I've listed briefly on page 3 the number of civil rights marches, so-called, from Liverpool to Nottingham, from London to Birmingham was the first of them, and I walked myself on the full length from Liverpool to London. It's a good long walk. We took 2 weeks to do it. A couple of dozen people, Connolly Association members who do part of their holidays perhaps to go on these marches, holding meetings along the way, telling the local people and the local provincial newspapers, etc., about the abuses in the north of Ireland. Generally, this of course made no impact on the national scene, but it sometimes had a bit of impact on the local scene, and local radicals, C&D people, Labourites, CP people and so on would come and support the marches as they arrived in a particular town. And although these marches didn't make national news, they were noticed in the north of Ireland because they were released in several towns. Senator Douglas, I think it was, who was then Secretary of the Ulster Unionist Council, wrote to the local newspapers trying to counter the propaganda, the anti-unionist propaganda of this dreadful crowd who were passing through your town. So it was noticed, even those civil rights marches. The Connolly Association in the early 60s organised a number of visits by British notabilities, usually Labourite or some MPs to the north of Ireland. I remember the 5th anniversary of the Covenant example. There was all sorts of jamboree on the Unionist side, on the Covenant, 62 it was. And the Connolly Association organised delegation to the north to observe the goings-on there. And of course there was an annual lobby, sometimes more often annually, of the British House of Commons, putting in where people could go in and put in their Labour or MPs, usually Labour, sometimes Liberal. I don't think ever Tory, but asking would you raise this issue in the House of Commons and so on. And that went on. The important point to bear in mind, the point in 13, that the Connolly Association was affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties, which at that time, certainly I don't know about now, was a very important organisation in British progressive circles. The NCCL took up all sorts of civil liberties issues, have been around since the early 30s. And it was also affiliated to the Movement for Colonial Freedom, which was an important body at a time when Britain still had large colonies. And the late Sean Redmond represented the Executive Association throughout the 60s on the executives of both the NCCL and the Movement for Colonial Freedom. So he and Redmond and others were pushing for these bodies to take up the abuses in the north of Ireland, and indeed they did. There was an important conference in the early 60s, 65 I think, organised by the National Council for Civil Liberties, to which John Taylor, as a young unionist, came along, and all the northern elements were represented. And it was held by the NCCL, having been pressed and pushed by the Connolly Association to do that. And that's readily documented and easily available on the websites and so on. So it was some Labour members of the Connolly Association who actually set up or initiated the setting up of the Campaign for Democracy in Ulster, which occurred in 1965, which just campaigned within the Labour Party, not more widely. The campaign with the CDU, and all these documents are up in the Lindenhall Library, which was some CA member, Bill O'Shaughnessy and others who initiated that. An important element, an important moment in spreading the anti-unionist message. As I mentioned on page 4 there, Premier Terence O'Neill actually responded personally to a memorandum sent to him by the Connolly Association Standing Committee in 1966, seeking to defend his regime. And particularly the fact that the Connolly Association was emphasising the Government of Ireland Act could set up partition and empowers the British Parliament to do anything in relation to the North of Ireland, including set up an inquiry, which they were pushing. and that this convention is nonsense, that issues devolved to the north couldn't be raised in Westminster. So O'Neill opened, I was entertained to read your complex and ingenious version of our constitutional status. It completely fails to take into account that constitutional questions within the British Commonwealth have a conventional as well as a legislative basis. So the conventional basis being that matters given to Stormont shouldn't be raised in Westminster. But of course, that was O'Neill seeking to defend essentially an indefensible position, and became clearly indefensible when the civil rights movement got going north of Ireland itself in 1968. So as I say on page 4 there, when Jerry Fitt was elected an MP for Belfast West in Westminster, he had previously been MP for Dock Ward in the Stormont Parliament, but Jerry Fitt, of course, was a close friend of the association and Greaves knew him and all the rest of it. But and the association organised his first meetings in London and before he became an MP and all that. But when he was elected in 1968, which is an important development, that he was for the first time was a significant, a new voice from the north, from West Belfast, representing the Westminster Parliament. We found quite a significant block of Labour MPs largely, of whom the best known would be Stan Orme, Paul Rose, Marcus Lipton. They'd be known to some people still. Stan Orme later became quite prominent in British politics. And when Fitt was banged on the head on October the 5th, I was actually in Derry. I came arrived just the police were doing the banging. I wasn't at the wrong side of the police line. I came as an observer from Dublin on October the 5th, 1969, 68 rather, when the RT's television cameras caught the police battening the marches, and they went around the world, and suddenly the whole thing exploded and became a matter of British and world attention. And I came as an observer from Dublin on behalf of the Wood Front Society, which was the secretary at the time, and would arrive just as the police were battering the marches. But Fitt was in the front row, and later they went to the local hotel. I forget the name of the hotel, but Fitt was going around all evening with his blooded shirt showing it off, you know. And so he was lucky enough to get battened, and there was blood in his shirt, and he was drawing every camera in sight, drawing attention to it. But when he was there, when that happened, though, he had 3 Labour MPs with him. I think Anne and Russell Kerr, I think were the names. I think John Ryan. I couldn't check up that. But the 3 Labour MPs with him in the front row, who belonged to Harold Wilson's party in London, and of course that helped also. So that was a clear example of the way in which Fitt had colleagues in London who were outraged at these developments. And so therefore the basic point I'm making is that long before anything significant stirred in the north of Ireland, there was a significant movement in Britain going back to 1958, the Malin Talbot trial and so on, seeking to educate significant sections of British Labour and trade union opinion on the abuses that prevail in the north of Ireland. And that's an important point, therefore, of the civil rights story, quite apart from any particular personal influence that Greaves had on the likes of me or Benny Sinclair or his colleagues in the CP or whatever, which also, of course, was important. Because in relation to the CP, it's important to bear in mind that the Communist Party was the only party in Britain that was in favour of partition, against partition rather, and in favour of Irish reunification since its foundation. And while Greaves was often, I can tell you, very critical of his party for its failure to push the Irish question, he said they're far more concerned about Vietnam, or some of them are, or South Africa, and they don't give Ireland the proper attention it should get. His diary is full of stuff about on those lines. It was, of course, the only party which favoured broadly ending partition, Irish unification, and helped this movement of seeking to educate public opinion in those important years. So there was a big change between 58 and 68, and as I said earlier on, between 1949 and 1969, in relation to the politics of the North of Ireland in Britain itself, which should not be ignored. I just want to conclude by saying that when the civil rights movement blew up in the North, it was what was going to happen. What? The British government was responsible. How were they going to deal with these problems? Were they going to legislate over Stormont's head? Or were they going to abolish Stormont? That was the big issue. But Britain Westminster Parliament could have legislated all sorts of things. They could have legislated in London to end gerrymandering, 1 person, 1 vote. It was illegal at the time to fly the Irish flag north of the border. I mean, all these were under the Special Powers Act. Britain could abolish the Special Powers Act if they legislated in London. And of course, the last thing they wanted to do was to intervene. They wanted to sustain the myth that this was a local thing. It was too embarrassing to preside over it. You know, they were happy that the sleeping dogs lie. That was the value of that convention. And they didn't want to interfere. It walked fine for 50 years. So Harold Wilson was very reluctant to interfere, even if there were backbenchers pressing him. And Mrs. McCluskey was writing to him, and others from the campaign for social justice, pressing Wilson to do all sorts of things, but he's very reluctant to interfere until his hand was ultimately forced. And what was it going to be forced to do? Greaves's conception was that the best solution was a Bill of Rights for the North, which would be legislated at Westminster over the heads of Stormont, preventing the Stormont Parliament doing bad things like abusing people or having anti-discrimination practices and so on, and encouraging them to do good things, namely to develop closer relations with the South. And he put that forward in a letter to Wilson in July '68, a month before the first Civil Rights March in the north of Ireland, the Colan Dungannon affair. It was a brilliant political conception, it's a progressive way forward, I suggest. In the light of subsequent events, it is a tragedy it was not adopted. It could have provided a framework within which Britain, if it so wished, could have moved towards peaceful disengagement from Ireland. And it could have created a situation where, over time, sections of unionist opinion might have come to look more favourably on a united Ireland. But that this was not done was due to the British government's desire to shore up Ulster unionism and avoid Westminster legislation at all costs. And when, as you know, the Civil Rights Movement Civil Rights Association was founded in '67, the first march was '68, the sectarian tension rose, Belfast exploded, and there were hundreds of Catholic homes burned down in August '69. The Republicans the Republicans up to then had supported the Civil Rights Movement, and the movement split, and you had the foundation of the Provisional IRA basically in January 1970, and they went on the military offensive more or less straight away or very early on. But when in 1972 Ulster unionism could no longer be sustained, the momentum for direct rule and abolishing the Stormont Parliament altogether had built up at Westminster. I make this point here on page 5. The call for direct rule from London, and a similar call was made way back in 1800, direct rule. You know, the College Green Parliament is so nasty and has crushed the United Irishmen with such, so nastily, that great if it was abolished and it was a rule from London direct, when London was really the master. The momentum for direct rule and abolishing Stormont altogether had built up at Westminster. The call for direct rule, I think it's fair historically to say, came first from the leftist students of the People's Democracy, Michael Farrell and Eamon McCann and Bernard Devlin and company. They were the first to call for direct rule. It was taken up by the newly formed Provisionals after they were formed in 1970, after the Republican movement split. That demand swept like wildfire to the Parliamentary Labour Party, and it was Wilson then lost office, was replaced by Heath, and as Greaves commented, it was eventually acceded to by the Tory Prime Minister Edward Heath like a cat being driven into a dairy. So instead of one man, one vote, you had one man, no vote for 25 years more or less, until a local parliament or local assembly was set up again in 1999, which is currently suspended, as you know. So the Bill of Rights conception was the counterpart to direct rule. And actually Greaves drafted the Bill of Rights in proper parliamentary form. It was published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office, as all bills must be, before they're submitted to Parliament. And on the anniversary of James Connolly's death, in May, the 12th of May 1971, that Bill of Rights was actually submitted to the House of Commons by Arthur Latham, a Labour MP, and in the House of Lords on the same day by Fenner Brockway. And the government opposed a three-line whip to refuse a bill at the first reading in the House of Commons, and was rejected in the second reading in the House of Lords. An important moment, but it actually was rejected. Harold Wilson was now out of office. He'd lost the opportunity to make a progressive contribution to solving the Irish problem, and Heath was in charge. And instead you had direct rule, of course, and its delights, for the next 25 years. As far as I know, I've seen no reference in the massive books that have appeared on the Northern Troubles to this particular fact that a bill was actually put into the House of Commons, and even if it was rejected, it's worth noticing. So you had direct rule instead. By now, we're not going to how the temperature rose in the north of Ireland and sectarianism rose, and then you had the provisional movement formed and all that. But by 1971, as I say in the third last paragraph there of those notes, the Northern Civil Rights Movement was wholly sidelined by 71. It began in 67-8, but 71 was really sidelined. British and international opinion, which 3 years before had been behind the non-violent civil rights marches, now saw the Northern problem as one of containing IRA terrorism. Now, the whole attitude changed. A new issue now, containing IRA terrorism. This was how it was presented, of course. There followed the quarter-century-long military campaign of the original IRA, until a new generation of Northern Republicans led by Adams and McGuinness ended this in 1994. There's no doubt that the IRA's armed struggle generated new divisions between Northern Protestants and Catholics. That's a fact of life. On the other hand, it's very important always to bear in mind that the ultimate responsibility for the violence in the North, however, must lie with successive British governments that had let the injustice in Northern Ireland and the civil rights abuses there fester undisturbed for decades, resisting reform attempts that were made, particularly in Britain, to get the situation improved long before the thing blew up in the north of Ireland itself, while nationalist Catholic resentments grew and grew. As you know, today we have the Good Friday Agreement. It's a commitment to a regime of equality of treatment and parity of esteem between Northern Catholics and Protestants. Essentially, I suggest this is civil rights redivivus, civil rights revived. Equality of treatment and parity of esteem are the only basis on which the possibility exists of Northern Unionists rediscovering over time the political implications of the common Irishness they share with their nationalist fellow countrymen and women. And that is certainly the only way in which a united Ireland can, by consent, can ever be attained. The role of the Connolly Association in bringing this situation to the attention of the world has been neglected by historians to date, and I hope that our session today and what some of the points I've made and the material of the Irish Democrat and so on will help to remedy that particular historical failure by our historians. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. Now, I'm going to call next on Mick Kelty, but those of you who may have questions to Tony will hear Michael's contribution, and then there'll be ample time for questions and maybe as well discussion, and we'll see how we go along. Are you happy with that? Yeah? Now, I'm pleased to introduce to you the General Secretary of the Connolly Association. We are again, and I repeat that, lucky to have Mick Kelty doing all the Trojan work that he does on behalf of the Connolly Association. And in actual fact, for the short space of time that he's been with us, you know, the recognition and the attention that's given from people in Britain, including the trade unions, of course, is on the way up. Although membership these days of any organisation is rather difficult, we live in, I'll put this in inverted commas, I call it the technological retrogressive society. But of course there are advantages to it as well, and we have to use technology, and Michael Kelty is excellent at that. But of course he's more than that. He comes from Wexford. I mean, you can't help that. But he's worked, well, he was at university here in Wexford, and then he has done work over in different parts of Britain, and I'm pleased to say that eventually he got around to a trade union in Britain, and it happened to be the Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union. He's a researcher there, but as I say, he not only does that work, but he does excellent work on behalf of the association. So, Mick Kelty.
Tony, just to say before I start, I had a bit of a problem with my laptop, just wait out about the technological skills, whatever else, it wouldn't turn on Friday, so if this comes across as a bit clunky or whatever else, it's been done in a little bit of a hurry, so if things are missed or whatever, or things need clarification, I'm happy to do that to questions. But anyway, according to the programme, I'm here to speak on the 80 years of the association and its contribution to building political solidarity with the Irish in Britain. Tony's covered the early years of the association, its origins, the early campaigns, the adoption of the new constitution and its involvement in the civil rights movement. I'm going to try to give a general overview of the association and the approach it took to the national question here, and how its approach to that question was defined by the country that it operates in. It was defined by the fact that it's in Britain. So it's important to underline that the association always sought a constitutional resolution to the Irish question which would deliver both of its aims and objects, namely a united independent Irish Republic and the removal of all obstacles placed in its way by British imperialism and equitable treatment for all the Irish people living in Britain. Ultimately, this necessitated a recognition by the British government of the right of the people of Ireland to national self-determination, which contains within it the right to national unity. In this way, the association didn't consider itself to be a part of the Irish struggle itself, but sought to win support for it. So on the face of it, the association very clearly defined aims and objects and clearly defined methods, and it appears first of all to be quite a simple organisation, but it's when you look at the context that they operate in, it becomes a bit more complex. So the associations had to tread a difficult path whereby on the one hand addressing the immediate political concerns of the Irish in Britain, they could be concerns ranging from opposition to conscription in the Second World War to the release of political prisoners, and on the other hand also trying to build and retain influence in a labour movement in an imperialist country where the leadership of that labour movement, the vast majority of them, had to a greater or lesser extent been in some way complicit in maintaining difficulties between Britain and Ireland. The Irish question was seen as an embarrassment or a potential disturbance to their own concerns, and the association was in a position where if we were to win the support of the British working class movement, the Irish in Britain had to be seen as a factor that would strengthen that movement. So it was the way we engaged with it was on that basis. So the association never sought to conduct a balancing act between two separate sets of concerns, but recognised that campaigning on issues of democracy and its advancement was a unifying factor in winning the support of the working class in Britain, of which the Irish were a substantial part. And of course, the highest level at which democracy can operate effectively is national level, where a demos actually exists, and so the democratic principle of internationalism came to the fore. As part of this internationalist approach, the association defended the important principle that people should not interfere in other people's countries, and that activists should take part in the politics of the country they're living in accordance with that country's political culture and rules. And so it was kind of a my house, my rules, or your house, your rules approach, which I think is a basic cornerstone of international relations, or how it should be conducted. But through campaigning on an internationalist basis, the association regularly provided analysis of the interactions between the British and Irish states and outlined the implications of the evolving relationship between the two states to the peoples of both Britain and Ireland, as well as providing commentary on the trajectory of international relations as a whole. Once we begin to understand the context within which it operates, its interaction with the British political system on the basis of the international relations between both Britain and Ireland, its role as a representative body for the Irish migrant community in Britain, and its interaction with other Irish organisations, the association obviously becomes a more complex thing to be looking at. So fundamentally, the association is an organisation which seeks to advance democracy, and this has been the basis of its approach to every question it's been faced with. Over 80 years, it consistently counterposes democratic aims against the aims of imperialism. 80 years, as Tony said, can't be covered in a 20 or 25 minute talk, even by one or more of us, It's impossible to do that. So I'm going to try to look at a couple of issues to give an understanding of where the association comes from. And I think it's important to see how the association is distinguished from other Irish Republican organisations, which we don't seek to differentiate ourselves from them, but we are different. We operate in a different context, and we wouldn't consider ourselves to be part of the immediate family of Irish Republicanism. I'm sure a lot of people here would have a first or second cousin, living in England, and they wouldn't be telling you how to do your shopping at home. You know what I mean? It's we never sought to do that with the Republican movement in Ireland. The association explains that aspect of its constitution as being implicit in the wording that it doesn't operate in Ireland. The words are to win support for the struggle of the Irish people, not to lead or wage it. The particular kind of support is then spelled out. British imperialism has erected a number of barriers in the way of Irish emancipation. For example, the border that partitions the country, the trade pact, economic policies and so on. Possibly the time will come when the Irish people smash these barriers down. The best way that we could try to help them is to try to have them taken down by the people who put them there. Furthermore, the association thinks that its aims and policies should be enough for all the Irish workers in Britain, and that there's no need for any other general organisation. It does look, as I said, the explanation of our constitution, life isn't that simple, and we do cooperate with other organisations provided that they're not opposed to our own core aims and objects. And the way that other organisations, when it comes into it, and how immediate that problem was, so the association was founded the 4th of September 1938. So it's 80 years ago earlier this week, and its first newspaper came out the following January, in January 1939, Of course, the other thing that happened in January 1939 was the S-Plan started. So the very first thing that the association had to deal with was an IRA bombing campaign in England, a brand new one that ran concurrent to the publication of the paper. So this, of course, caused discussions within a new young organisation of how do you deal with something like this. And the front page of the February edition, after these bombs had gone off, read "Explosions in Britain and British imperialist policy in Ireland." The association commented that the bombings wouldn't have happened were it not for the dictatorship in the 6 counties and that the British national government was to blame. It said that, "One thing we do know, that the attitude of self-complacent horror, which so many people have adopted, shows a shallow misunderstanding of the whole history and present position of Ireland's struggle for freedom, not to say a cowardly refusal to face the facts. Behind all the newspaper excitement over the bombs and arrests lies a story of brutal misgovernment and terror in 6 counties of our country, which, paralleled anywhere else in the world, would have led to explosions." Now, this went on for the full page, and I think I showed the article to a colleague here earlier, and he commented that the guts of it looked as though it could have been written by the IRA itself, But the conclusion of the article was that students of Connolly must look further than mere condemnation to solve this question. We must win as our allies the support of all progressive forces in Britain, and it is evident that the explosions will not achieve this. So the statement was accompanied anyway by a declaration from Sean O'Casey saying that your policy is the only possible policy for Irish men living in England, and an appeal for Republican prisoners from Mrs. Austin Stack on behalf of the Irish Prisoners National Aid Society. The following month, the association felt it necessary to go further. There was obviously discussion within the association, within the wider progressive movement in Britain, about how the bombings have been reported. And the March edition of the paper, the headline read, "Bombings cannot win a united Ireland," and it denounced terrorism as a policy. It stated that the cause of Irish unity and freedom can never be achieved by the methods of terrorism. This policy is based on the erroneous theory that terrorist acts serve as a substitute for mass political action. It shows a lack of confidence in the development of such action on the part of the men and women of Ireland. Therefore, it acts as a barrier to the development of the initiative and activity of the people and retards the creation of a powerful movement upon which success must depend. The ability of explosions to retard political activity was equally, if not so, more applicable in Britain. So Desmond Greaves, anyway, I think felt that the second edition of the paper had actually gone too far, and he commented that the first editorial urged all Irish workers in their own interest to join their appropriate trade unions. That was the very first edition of the paper. But that month the IRA declared war on England and the bombs started to go off. Friends in the labour movement thought that if the Connolly Club could advise Irish people to join trade unions, they could advise the IRA not to let off bombs. They didn't understand that while most of the Irish in London were opposed to the bombs that threatened to bring a witch hunt on them, they would think it unpatriotic to say so in the hearing of the English. There was much heart-burning over the issue. In the end, the paper came out with a headline denouncing the bombing, and the club lost face among the Irish. So that's what Greaves his own reminiscences of it. And the guts of it, that remains the association's approach to this day. I'm not going to try to say that the provisional campaign was the exact same as the S plan and that it can just be written off as terrorism or anything like that. I'm not trying to do that, but in terms of that type of activity in Britain, the association has been very clear on its position. It's important to recognise that the association never blamed violence in Britain on Irish Republicans, rather recognised and repeatedly declared that it was a result of Britain's claim to sovereignty over part of Ireland and the tyrannical nature of the regime in the 6 counties. In summary, Greaves commented if people wanted the IRA to stop IRAing, they should stop giving them things to IRA about. So, as well as that, I think it's important to note that where you had political prisoners in Britain, the association consistently campaigned for the release of political prisoners, regardless of what they were in prison for. Irish political prisoners. Well, when I say regardless, it's the Irish Republican political prisoners. But an analysis of the coverage given in the Irish Democrat and the comments of the association would see that while advocating a peaceful resolution of the conflict, the association did distinguish between military activity in Ireland and acts of terrorism in Britain, without, it has to be said now, ever endorsing an armed campaign. And the association has often been directly or indirectly blamed for fractures within republicanism. a suggestion we repudiate in its entirety. The association has always called for the maximum possible unity of the national movement in Ireland, as well as unity of the Irish in Britain. And this is evidenced from its approach to split within the IRA and later Sinn Féin. It's quite commonly said about the split. There's a number of individuals, several of whom are in the room, that fingers get pointed at and blamed at if you do a quick Google of the split, you know. And it comes back to the association. In the end, the accusation usually does. What the association actually said at the time of the split is worth reading. Well, I'll read it to you. But in 1970, the association described the Ardèche as being the biggest and saddest for years. It gave rise to a deplorable and unnecessary split in which worthy, patriotic Irishmen are using bitter words against each other while British imperialism laughs in the background. The comment, while there's still a chance of the two sides sorting out their disagreements and uniting the organisation on which so much hope is placed, would be out of place and irresponsible. Any discussion must be confined to policy, and such words as traitor on the one side or reactionary on the other should never be used. Reeves commented that what was needed was a spell of discretion, during which the dissonant elements of the Republican movement could sort out their differences without other people breathing down their necks. The association should intensify its activity against British imperialism to see that it profited as little as possible from the unhappy divisions that had arisen, and the CA did focus its activity as such. When the situation deteriorated to the point of almost no return, the association maintained its focus on the British government. Within hours of the horrendous events of Bloody Sunday in January 1972, the CA brought out a special bulletin on the incident and distributed it widely. CA meetings throughout Britain, members called for the resignation of the Home Secretary and for a full and independent inquiry. Decades later, the association would be continuing to support bereaved families of that massacre, along with other victims of the conflict, when they had to travel to England for investigations, inquiries, or simply to make their voices heard. CA opposed calls, and Tony's dealt with this, I'll very briefly run over it, but opposed calls for the abolition of Stormont and found itself somewhat isolated in warning of the dangers of ending Stormont and giving all powers to London. We saw this as yet another example of imperial control taking away even a small amount of local decision making, and the CA believed that a reformed Stormont was preferable to direct rule, and that principle is equally applicable today. Direct rule was imposed in 1972, and the CA looked to a Bill of Rights to be included in any new devolutionary arrangements and set out the need for the British government to declare its intention to withdraw. The imposition of internment led the association to call for a committee to coordinate opposition to it, the Emergency Provisions Act, and actions by British military forces. The Ulster Workers' Strike in 1974 led to the collapse of Sunningdale, and the CA condemned it as a challenge to democracy by some of the most reactionary forces in these islands, and published a pamphlet, 14 Days of Fascist Terror. We organised a speaking tour across Britain of trade unions from Belfast, actual trade unions from Belfast, to explain what was going on. Following the upsurge of bombings in England in the mid-1970s, the Irish communities were subjected to the draconian powers of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. The CA criticised the bombing campaign as counterproductive, at the same time calling for the Irish community to oppose reactionary measures used against it. The CA also supported the campaigns, for example, the Free, the Bombing of 6 and the Guildford 4. So that's summary kind of our relations with the wider Republican movement. And not very comprehensively, but you see the distinction in how we operated and because of where we were based. The second thing I'd like to address, the association's contribution to an understanding of the national question. As an organisation rooted in labour and democratic movements in Britain, I consider our most important contribution, especially in light of recent developments or underlined by recent developments, as being our consistent attempts to instil within those movements an understanding and appreciation of the national question. Following the Second World War, attempts were being made across Europe to advocate free trade as a cornerstone of macroeconomics on the basis that it was protectionism that had led to the outbreak of the Second World War. With empires increasingly being challenged and the highly protectionist policies of Europe's dominant imperialist countries restricting the availability of markets, capitalists of those countries were driven to aggressive expansion. It began as an inter-imperialist conflict. This line of argument was used to advocate the need for free trade, or rather for the needs of the capitalist classes of those dominant countries to have unfettered access to other economies, as opposed to democratic control of national economies. And in Ireland it was advanced by T.K. Whittaker and Sean Lemass, and it manifested itself in the programmes for economic expansion and in the Anglo-Irish trade talks of the early 60s. Ultimately, the adoption of laissez-faire policies by both states would see British industry destroyed and Irish industry strangled in its crib, with the reversal of attempts since the 1930s to develop indigenous industry. And see the workers of both countries placed firmly under the yoke of finance and capital. And militarily, the developments will be overseen by NATO, which brings Britain's strategic goals into focus, in that Ireland's position on the Atlantic approach to Europe and all the rest is of major military importance, but incidentally it's much like Cyprus or Korea, which are both also divided to this day. The Connolly Association was, we believe, in a unique position to comment from an Irish perspective on these developments. So, when the structured Irish economy was under review by the late 50s, with a programme for economic expansion declaring the minimal role the state would play in industrial development, limiting it to only unprofitable sectors. The early Anglo-Irish trade talks in 1960 were described by the association as just an attempt to sell tariffs. The proposal was that Irish tariffs would be abolished in return for Irish cattle to receive the same price in Britain as British cattle. And the British rejected the proposal, with the association commenting, "Very well then, don't try to sell them. Put them up, not down. Trade to other countries. Bring back investments from abroad and set up industries in Ireland to keep our people at home and eat our own beef. Why not?" So in the following May 1961, the Association's Irish Democrat became the first publication in Britain to oppose the drive towards European integration and supranational governance, the first printed publication to actually oppose it. This is the same edition of the paper that announced the first Civil Rights March, which Tony covered earlier. I think that's quite a document, that paper, the paper of May 1961, in that it really set out the two major topics that would preoccupy the association for the following years. The article said, "While the advantages of the common market are uncertain and seem to offer little of substance, one thing is clearly offered. That lies in the guarantee of free mobility of capital and labour. The Irish capitalist, who has already sent 600 million of Irish money overseas, will be given greater facilities for investing abroad. The Irish man and woman will be given a far wider choice of places to emigrate to." In July 1961, Ireland and the UK both applied to join the EEC unsuccessfully, and in 1963 the second programme for economic expansion declared, "In these years every sector of the economy must adapt itself to the new economic environment created by the evolution of the European Economic Community and the movement towards freer trade in Western Europe and North America, the areas in which we have the closest trading relations," which is quite interesting. If the same principle was applied today, people would be discussing Ireland's relationship with the European Union in a very different way. If you're looking at our largest trading partners post-Brexit. But in early 1965, Lemass called an early general election. The association said to scatter his opposition and get a safe 5 years of office in which Fianna Fáil could get the country into the common market. And so he had attached his personal prestige to the policy of retreat from the national struggle in Fianna Fáil. And what followed was a series of trade talks in London in order to establish a free trade area covering the UK and Ireland, which the Irish Democrat broke the silence on. There was a printer's strike in Dublin at the time, and it meant there was very, very little discussion of those talks in the newspapers here. And commentators could only really speculate on what was going on. The Dáil was in recess as well. The periodical Business and Finance at the time, a weekly survey of Ireland's trade, finance and property market, that's how it describes itself, had a headline, "Exclusive Anglo-Irish Common Market, the border to go." You know, which echoes like a lot of arguments that we hear nowadays during the Brexit process. The Vice President of the Labour Party at the time claimed what they were discussing was the re-entry of the 26 counties into the United Kingdom. If Mr Lemass and Mr Haughey have their way, the 26 counties will be as much a part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland is today. Sinn Féin claimed it was nothing less than another act of union. Even Fine Gael wanted to know, what is to happen to Irish economic independence, the development of markets outside Britain, the effect of British competition in agriculture and the maintenance of employment? The Connolly Association commented of the British Prime Minister, "What a disgrace a Labour Premier should lend himself to the restoration of the old imperialism." But the full consequences of that agreement were yet to become evident or be realised. In June 1967, the association covered the then Taoiseach Jack Lynch's admission that the pact this trade deal, contained secret clauses, one of which was that Ireland must enter the EEC should Britain be admitted into membership, whatever the cost to Ireland. Ireland was effectively coerced into membership of the European Union via an agreement that hadn't been discussed in the newspapers here. They got very little time in the Dáil, and that's where we are now. So the association in particular, in trying to develop the thinking around these issues, produced a pamphlet based on a lecture delivered in 1968 by Greaves, who outlined that national independence is one of the most important forms of democracy. It is playing and will play a decisive role in the dethronement of the parasitic class, which had no more interest in the British or French workers than an economic army of occupation. The freedom of all nations to develop without external interference, but in growing mutual collaboration, by which the national divisions that separate humanity can be transformed from elements of misunderstanding and antagonism into components of a world culture that preserve all that is valuable from the past, which I think is a fantastic way to describe an internationalist approach. So, following January 1973, the formal accession of Ireland and Britain into the EEC, a death notice appeared on the front page of the Irish Democrat, written, it said, "Democracy, RIP." And the death notice read, it said, "On 31st of December 1973, 2 or 3, the typo there, British and Irish democracy ceased to exist. The two countries are now under tyrannies. We advise no rash action. Tyrants can bite nastily. Over the next few years will unfold the bitter fruits of the incredible wickedness of the politicians who bulldozed the peoples of these islands to their ruin in Europe. Already in Ireland and Britain, excellent organisations are being formed to resist the effects. But above all, we counsel using the established machinery of the working class movement, which alone is strong enough to win back our freedom." In June 1975, a referendum was held regarding the UK's membership of the EEC, and the association threw itself into that campaign. And on the front page of the Irish Democrat, under the masthead, "Against the Common Market from the day it started," the headline read, "We hope that every Irish worker will go out and vote no to the Common Market on June the 5th. If he feels any doubt or he doesn't understand all the complicated economic argumentation put out purposefully to confuse, let him look at the men who are now supporting it and compare them with the men who are opposing it. The supporters of the Common Market are the traditional enemies of Ireland and the Irish, the Tory establishment, the Lords, big business, the most right-wing members of the Labour Party, and save the mark, the two-nation merchants of the so-called British and Irish Communist Organisation, which has been described, by the way, as neither British, Irish, Communist, nor yet an organisation." This is a direct quote, by the way. On the other side are the traditional friends of Ireland, trade unions by overwhelming majority, the rank and file and best leaders of the Labour Party, our Celtic cousins in Wales and Scotland, plus every single Republican strand in the Irish community in Britain. Surely you'll stand up and be counted with the second group rather than the first. So the association put that in very stark terms, the Irish in Britain. And of course the referendum was lost and forced its reaction, but the association continued to actively campaign for national sovereignty, not only for Ireland, but as a principle for all nations. In 1985, the association organised a conference on national sovereignty and the defence of the nation state to be held in Conway Hall in London. At this conference, it was declared that within the labour movement, there are sections that decry the national independence struggle as a diversion from the task of getting socialism. They really mean talking about socialism, for there's scarcely one progressive step decided on by a Labour Party conference that would not involve the defiance of the EEC and flouting its rules. Tremendous pressures would be applied, but up to now there has been no European army to enforce the will of Brussels. It's time that the Labour movement declared national sovereignty to be one of the fundamental elements of democracy. The British people have a fight for sovereignty on their hands. Sovereignty for the Welsh and the Scots, if they want it, is up to them. Stands in no sort of opposition to this. And as for the Irish, they'll go on fighting for it until the majority of the Irish people rule the whole of their country. So the associations maintained this position regarding the common market and campaigned for a leave vote in the referendum on Britain's membership of the EU in 2016. If anything, the reasons to oppose the common market have been magnified since 1975. And that would be why we held that position, and we have since then continued to campaign for a genuine Brexit, one that actually means leaving the control of the European institutions. Following the defeat of the Labour government in 1979, I'm coming up towards the end here now, but following the defeat of the Labour government in 1979, the Labour Party reassessed its Irish policy, which for a decade had reflected the views of Britain's military and civil service establishment. In 1981, Labour adopted a policy of Irish unity by consent, following intensive lobbying by the association. The association, of course, wanted more than that, but this is the result anyway, which was an important advance and one which the CA felt that it contributed significantly to. The Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 sought to isolate Republicans and Nationalists from the political process, and the Association described the agreement as the most squalid and contemptible piece of hypocrisy since Lloyd George swindled Michael Collins. In the following years, the CA organised another major conference, this time on Irish unity, which was sponsored by national trade unions. The first such conference that enjoyed that type of sponsorship, and resulted in the trade union network on Ireland being established, which brought together many trade unions from throughout Britain to look at ways of building support for Irish unity within the trade union movement. The CA is supportive of the political process arising from the Hugh Adams initiative, including the Good Friday Agreement, and in many ways the Connolly Association's civil rights campaigning and demands prefigured some aspects of the agreement. We maintained our criticism of the role of the British state throughout the process. For example, the Association reluctantly welcomed the Downing Street Declaration as a small and slow step forward, but criticised the failure of the British government to recognise the value of a united Ireland and the absence of a commitment to act as a persuader for one, as opposed to this fake neutrality which the British government would claim to have in terms of decisions being made in relation to the North now. So the Connolly Association worked to build support for the agreement and a constitutional way forward within the Labour movement, and continues to argue for Britain to meet its obligations under the agreement, under Good Friday and subsequent agreements, and has worked to advance progress being made on dealing with the past. So just to conclude, anyway, to wrap up, 40 years ago, Desmond Grieve commented that the Association had attempted to concern itself with every issue that arises from the presence of an Irish community in Britain, and to develop it in a way which promotes the independence of Ireland and the welfare of the common people in Britain, and that remains our policy to this day. Like many left-leaning organisations, the years of the mid-90s proved to be difficult times. Despite the challenges, the Connolly Association remains active to this day, enjoys the support of over 1 million trade unionists through the affiliation of their branches and regional organisations, their national trade unions, and individual membership of the association has reached the same levels as we had during our most active years. We remain the oldest and largest political organisation of the Irish in Britain, and this has been reflected in messages of support and congratulations received in the past few weeks from various organisations in Ireland, including the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, the Irish Trade Union Federation, SIPTU Mandate, CWU, the INTO, Peace and Neutrality Alliance, even Fianna Fáil, leadership of Fianna Fáil, Irish Labour, Sinn Féin, the Communist Party of Ireland and the Workers' Party of Ireland have all sent messages of support and recognition to the association on our 80th anniversary. And we believe that what that underlines is the independence of the association in a way. In Britain it's quite common for the association to be maligned in one way or another. We'd either be a communist front or terrorist sympathisers or whatever other reason could be found for people not to engage with the Irish question. And the sort of recognition that we've received from back home would be useful in challenging that. So the non-sectarian left Republican outlook, which incorporates progressive interpretation of the national question, continues to induce the association to campaign without fear or favour for peace, justice and democracy in Ireland, and it remains central to the association's appeal. The changes within the Labour Party have brought fresh hope. Throughout our existence we have endeavoured to keep alive and disseminate the knowledge of James Connolly and what he stood for, and perhaps in years to come that will be assessed as our greatest achievement. And look, the association's work has to be continued. That's our message in our 80th anniversary year. The tide now, we believe, is flowing with us. Imperialism is staggering from one crisis to another. The unionists will never recover their former position, and too many people are now aware of the sort of their shady deals. So the association has done a lot in the past, and we hope we can make a greater contribution in the future. So thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Mick, for that detailed updating as to where we are. So those of you now who would like to ask questions to either Tony or Mick,